Hello, this is Barb Chamberlain, Director of the Active Transportation Division for the Washington State Department of Transportation, and you're listening to the Group Ride Podcast.
Welcome to episode 23 of the Group Ride Podcast. This is a podcast for cycling in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. I'm your host, Wes Salmon, and today on the show, I sit down with Barb Chamberlain from WSDOT's Active Transportation Division to talk about what her team is doing to help provide equal access for pedestrians and cyclists along Washington's transportation system. Clip in, riders, the Group Ride Podcast is rolling out. Today, I am in Seattle, Washington, talking to Barb Chamberlain of the WSDOT Active Transportation Division, a new division that was created to focus on areas of travel where you are the engine, you are the mode, so walking and cycling. So welcome to the show, Barb.
Thanks so much. Happy to be here.
Give me a quick overview of your background in cycling. This isn't your first job in cycling and policy. Tell me where you started.
Well, in a way, I started with the bike lane that the city of Spokane put in front of my house.
The bike lane.
The bike lane, because I could look out my window and see this invitation, the magic stripe of paint. The street was the same width that it was already, curb to curb, but the bike lane said, hey, you could ride your bike. And I was a bit of a recreational rider. I had been through being the mom pulling your babies in a bike trailer when I lived in Coeur d'Alene. I had been on a trail committee in Coeur d'Alene. So I'd worked on as an advocate and volunteer at times, but definitely wasn't an everyday rider. And that bike lane made me start riding to work, which was all of 3.5 miles, not that far. Downhill on the way to work, which of course meant uphill on the way home. It was really hot. It was over 100 degrees. It was mid-July. It was not the best first day for bike commuting you could have picked. But I started riding. I got to riding more and more. It became easier and easier and got more active as a volunteer. That led to eventually applying to be the executive director for what was then the Bicycle Alliance of Washington. And I just saw that as a dream job to run a nonprofit doing work I believed in. And did that for several years. Then we merged with Cascade Bicycle Club, so we now have 2 statewide bike nonprofits. And along came another dream job when the State Department of Transportation was going to elevate biking and walking to be alongside every other mode that we work on.
Yeah, you mentioned that there was a memo a couple months ago from Roger Millar about how WSDOT is no longer the Department of Highways. It's the Department of Transportation. That includes everyone. And he went into great detail about how important it is that all modes of transportation are treated equally across the board. So that was a great thing. And he mentioned your Active Transportation Division in that memo at the end. Tell me what, in your opinion, active transportation really means for people who don't want to necessarily buy a car or be in a car all the time.
Well, one thing it means is the most affordable and most fundamental form of transportation.
Or you haven't seen the kind of bikes I buy.
Okay. Yeah.
But you're right.
N plus one. But you can always go to a local community bike shop or, if it has to be a yard sale bike, it's a yard sale bike.
Right.
But you can always go out the door on your own 2 feet if you're somebody who walks. And I want to be clear that when I talk about pedestrian work or walking, I am including people who need a mobility device to get around.
Okay.
So if you are in a wheelchair, you are still part of what we mean when we say active transportation.
Gotcha.
That you're heading out the door, there isn't an internal combustion engine involved, might be one way of thinking about it.
Okay.
I can't go by the number of wheels because a wheelchair might have 4 wheels.
That's true. That is true.
But it really is the most fundamental. If you are on a bike, calorie for calorie, you're using the single most efficient form of transportation. You can just get farther. You don't have to be going fast, but if you're fueled by bagels, it's pretty darn efficient. Or, pastry of choice, insert here.
Right.
Gluten-free
Yeah.
if necessary.
Yeah.
So before we did anything else, that's what we did to get around. And yet, if you look at how most departments of transportation have been funded, have been structured, have been planned for, everything about them, once the car came along, it became the dominant thing that we were planning for. And it certainly offered a lot of advantages. It carries a lot. It moves pretty fast. But a lot of our day-to-day transportation, you actually don't do either of those things. You aren't carrying that much stuff, you and your briefcase, you and your lunchbox. That's just not that much. And you may or may not be going far, depends on where you are in the state and kind of what you do for work. But a lot of us, our basic day-to-day stuff, we don't need that much. We sort of have overkill if we're driving ourselves alone in 4,000 pounds of steel and moving a car from one storage location to another storage location and back again.
Right. An empty car usually.
Yes. We're not even carpooling. And so saying that active transportation is alongside all of the other modes is really starting to rebalance how we think about transportation. That we had a division already for public transportation, for aviation, which I like to point out was once a fad started by a couple of bike mechanics, and now apparently it's a thing. You know,
pretty popular.
There's a whole federal thingy-mabobber for that, and we certainly know where the airports are. Rail, freight, and ports is another division, and that's important to communities. My bike got to the local bike shop somehow. Might well have come in through train shipment or something. So we have all of these other modes recognized, and for Roger to create the Division of Active Transportation was to say we take seriously the need to plan, design, and build and maintain for every way that people get around.
So your team is really new. They started this year, I believe. Mm-hmm. How big is your team so far?
It's all of 3 people.
Wow.
3.0 FTE to use state employee talk.
Yeah.
We moved a couple of people who had been in the local programs division, and that's the division that does a lot of grant making to local governments. And so we already had grant buckets funded by the legislature for Safe Routes to School and for pedestrian and bike safety and mobility. And so the 2 people attached to those buckets, if you will, are now part of the division. So we'll keep making those grants, but doing it now within this context where really what we want to do is look at how we finish the network. And if you are a driver, you don't even have to think about a network because you just have one. You go out your driveway, you go to the first corner, and lo and behold, there's another strip of something attached to it for your car. And there's probably a sign that tells you the street names and everything.
Right.
And you know, if you walk or bike, you can't assume that the thing that was built for you continues around the corner.
Yeah, one of the things you never have a driver think about is wayfinding. But as a walker or as a person on a bike, you think of wayfinding. It's like, man, I got to find a sign to know which way to go.
Yeah. You look at, like they'll even tell you whether you're going north or south.
They don't care.
Yeah. And yet, if you're on almost any trail in the state and you come to a cross street, there will not be a sign that tells you what street you're crossing. Because after all, you're on a trail, you're just recreating, you don't really care where you're going. I mean, apparently, and I'm saddened by that.
Yeah, you would never get off that trail. Why would you?
Yeah. And if you don't have a smartphone, when I first moved to Seattle and I was on the Burt Gilman Trail, I'm like, what is that thing down there? I can see a street. I have no idea where I am.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit disoriented. It's not where I'm used to riding my bike. I kept stopping and pulling out my phone to figure out where I was. And so street signs would have been really awesome.
So you've got a team of 3. What is one of your bigger goals you guys have planned for the next 18 to 24 months? Like if you had a list or prioritized big bucket items, what's the biggest thing you guys are working on?
Yeah. Well, I should first add to the team a bit because WSDOT has the central headquarters divisions like mine and then is divided into regions of the state. And in each region, there will be at least one person who has regional bike and pedestrian responsibilities as part of their job. It's usually a pretty small part, so 5% maybe, but at least there is a regional point of contact. And one of the first things we'll be working on is updating the statewide plan for biking and walking. We have one. If you look at it now, you'll see the date on the cover is 2008. That means they started the process in about 2006, so it's over a decade old. And so we want to update that both for the statement of what we need to accomplish for the state to have biking and walking really available, accessible, safe, connected everywhere. And then look at how does that translate to the regional level so that if your city has a bike plan and your regional metropolitan planning organization has a bike plan, do those two actually connect? And the MPOs are doing great work in that. But when they get to our off-ramps from state Department of Transportation right-of-way, can you safely get across those off-ramps? In many parts of the state, especially the more rural parts of the state, our road is the road.
Yeah.
It's the only way you get to town. And what I think is often not recognized is that we have deep pockets of rural poverty. And if your car breaks down and you have no other way to get to town, you're going to be walking along the side of the highway.
Yeah.
So we are the local network at that point, and yet it hasn't been built that way. We did a great job of doing what we were tasked with doing, and that wasn't thinking in terms of biking and walking. And so we need to just finish the job that we started.
And to be clear, you guys are covering all of Washington. This isn't a western side of Washington initiative. This is for all of Washington, the benefit of Spokane, as well as the benefit of Bellingham, as well as Tacoma and Olympia, all over the place.
Absolutely. And I think one of the benefits that I bring to the job is having lived in Spokane, having been in Eastern Washington. I like to point out my cell phone still has a 509 area code. And so I don't think just in terms of very urban Western Washington. Certainly, biking and walking are really fundamental transportation in Seattle. I have a much more predictable commute riding to work than I would driving to work. But anywhere in the state, there is something happening, whether it's bike tourism or wanting kids to be able to walk to school or bike to school in Ferry County. The Ferry County Rail Trail is a safe route to school. And you wouldn't automatically think of kids biking to school in Ferry County because it feels pretty rural, and yet there it is.
Yeah.
And so really everywhere in the state, people are interested in better connections. They're interested in the economic benefits of biking. They want it to be safe to cross the street.
Yeah.
That's pretty fundamental.
You mentioned a trail that was possibly not part of the Department of Transportation's actual networks, and that's part of, I think, what you hinted at, where multi-modes and multi-terrain is part of the deal here, because most people, if they have a choice of a protected, multi-use trail or a road, some of them are going to use a multi-use trail. And how do you get those people transitioned into the places they want to go through the road network? So do you guys work with a lot of the parks departments in the different jurisdictions in Washington who typically own those trails and own the maintenance and planning?
We'd be coordinating primarily around the hard surface trails. I'm making that distinction that it's not mountain biking, but certainly there are people whose awesome commute to work means start out on a soft surface or take a shortcut over a hill. It happens. So I hear. But the network piece, I think you're really onto something with thinking about local and regional and state as all one piece. You literally cannot drive something just on the part that belongs to the state. You are going to have to get onto the state right-of-way and off the state right-of-way.
Yeah.
And so if we all recognize that it is genuinely creating a whole that's more than the sum of its parts, then the state piece of this is better served if the local network is robust and fully connected and the regional network is fully connected, and our piece of it helps you get there.
Yeah.
And so really it's to our benefit if the local bike walk network is getting a lot of attention and a lot of investment and care, and then we can route you to that.
So you mentioned earlier that the organization is statewide. I'm interested to understand what type of reception you've gotten from other state agencies that you coordinate with on best practices and planning. Is this something that people are interested in from other states or other areas to learn more about how they could have a similar organization that's focused specifically on pedestrian and people who ride bikes?
I've talked to some of my counterparts around the country, and Washington is very much a leader in having a formal organizational structure that really puts biking and walking alongside the others. Other states may have something like Massachusetts, I point to. They have an Office for Sustainable Mobility that includes biking and walking. It also has responsibilities that are like our commute trip reduction. So it's a pretty big portfolio, and it's one person. It's not quite structured the same way. Every state is doing something because the Federal Highway Administration requires you to have somebody designated. I would also say, though, that Federal Highways has some new requirements that mean that other states should be paying attention to it. I think we're ahead in having a structure that will let us focus quickly, but there are new non-motorized performance measures from the federal government that we need to reduce the number of people driving alone, so that's biking and walking and rideshare and transit. And we need to reduce the number of people who are having serious injuries or dying who are biking or walking. And there are real penalties attached to that if we don't do it. So all the states have to pay attention. I think we're just organized in a way that'll let us do that really effectively and efficiently.
So while working with other organizations in other states, we kind of help build this groundswell of support where Washington blazes a trail for this type of work. What can local people do that want to benefit and also help out with the pedestrian and people who ride bikes issues in their area or in the state? Like, can they get involved? What are the things you would recommend a person who rides a bike or a pedestrian who is passionate about safety and access? What could they do to get involved?
Everybody just loves going to lots and lots of night meetings. That's what we need them to do. Roger has said that the local plan is our plan, meaning that the State Department of Transportation is in partnership with communities, with counties, with metropolitan planning organizations. Whatever the local plan says they need to complete a network, we need to be part of that. And our right-of-way is sometimes the barrier that you need to get across. So we need to see that you've got a way, you plan to come to it, and you plan to continue on the other side of it. It's our responsibility to help that work for our piece that's in the middle. So it's really, really critical to be involved in plans. it's pretty obvious to get involved in something like the master bike plan update. Everybody does that. What I would love people to do is get involved in other planning processes and say, okay, Chamber of Commerce, your economic development plan, where do you have bike tourism? Where do you have making downtown more walkable as real priorities? Public health, what are you doing for active community environments? Because we know that we'll save money on our healthcare costs. And so there are all kinds of plans where really, I like to think of the bike as this magic wand you wave and it solves all problems. School boards, have you asked your school board what decisions they're making about where they site schools? Do they site it and build it in a way that means that you can have your kids biking and walking to school? Or do they do it so that it's along the side of a state highway, meaning it's a little bit scary as a parent to send your kid down the shoulder? And do they focus on the parent car drop-off zone instead of the bike rack and the sidewalks? And so everything we do as a society, we either make it easier or harder to choose to bike and walk. So where can you get involved? Whatever's your other passion besides biking and walking, there is a way to make biking and walking part of that.
Interesting. So basically anything you do, if you can map it to in some way to walking or biking, you're highly likely to get more involved. And then getting involved at the local level, making sure that in the plans for those localities that pedestrian and bike infrastructure is accounted for and it's known to be something that the residents want, helps WSDOT prioritize those areas and make those connections whole.
Yes, absolutely.
Very cool. My last question is less about policy and more of a fun question. Tell me about your best day on the bike. You ride a lot. I see around your office a ton of bike stuff. So tell me about your best day on the bike.
It is hard to choose.
It's always hard to choose.
It's really hard to choose.
That's what makes biking awesome.
Yes. There is one day that is still my longest mileage to date. So that's a bit of an accomplishment. Day 2 was a little more painful. And that was doing a ride that doesn't exist anymore, Tour de Lac, when I was in Spokane and rode, around part of Lake Coeur d'Alene to Harrison. So that was fantastic. I did 94 miles. And there was this little piece of me that thought, if I did 6 more, I'd have a century. And then I thought, wait, no, I have to ride from Coeur d'Alene back to Spokane tomorrow. I already don't like my saddle. It's not going to get any better.
Yeah.
So I let that last 6 miles go. Another one, it's a story I sort of hate to tell, and yet it was really powerful for me. Last year, I crashed and broke my elbow.
Oh, no.
And then got a frozen shoulder afterwards as a side effect. So your shoulders and your elbows are apparently really important as shock absorbers. So
Yes.
I couldn't ride for quite a while. And I lost a piece of who I was in not riding. And so there was a day kind of late in the fall when I was able to do this kind of combination of bus, light rail, bike, back and forth between the modes and kind of run all over the way I was used to doing, where I said, I need to go downtown. I need to go to the grocery store. I need to get my hair cut. I'm going to stop at Pike Place Market. I had all these little things. And when you're on a bike, that is so simple. You just stop. You don't have to look for parking. I mean, you got to look for something to tie it to, right?
Right.
More bike racks are better.
Yeah.
But it is a lot less complicated than being on a car. And so I reclaimed that sense of freedom that I get from being on a bike. So as a comeback, I think that one's pretty high up there because I really understood what I had lost and I was getting it back.
So yeah, your best day on the bike, coming back from an injury, I can definitely see how it may not have been your best ride ever, but it was probably your best day. Once you feel like you're back and your injuries are healed up and you're capable again. I sprained both my shoulders in a mountain bike crash last year at the same time. So I was off the bike for like 6 weeks because I was in bad shape. But yeah, that first time I actually got to go out and ride for real was major. It was definitely major.
Yeah. That sense of freedom that a bike gets you, I don't think anything else has that. I do walk a lot of places, but walking is work. And biking is, as I said, calorie for calorie, pretty darn efficient. So you're flying along. And that feeling of freedom, it is the mode that gives you that sense of freedom.
Well, the great thing about biking, too, is compared to walking, not to say that walking is bad, is that you can coast and still move, and that is so fulfilling.
Yeah.
Like if you pay the tax of going up a hill and then coasting down the other side of it, you're moving, and it's one of those things. It's like, hey, this is free transportation for me. With walking, you can't coast. Same with running. That's why I don't run.
Working on it. You mentioned taxes, so there is a topic I'd like to touch on.
It's open forum. Let's hear it.
Everybody pays for transportation.
Yes.
Everybody pays for every bit of transportation, and you cannot move around only on what you personally paid for. That's not how it works.
Right.
And I think that is the single biggest misunderstanding about bike infrastructure in particular, is this notion that people on bikes didn't pay for what they're riding on. And that is, if we could do a Mythbusters session just on that, I would pull that one apart. There are so many ways that is not true, that everybody pays for everything. The local network, which is where a lot of the riding happens, is property taxes. So you're paying it. If you rent, it's in your rent. If you own a home, you know you're paying it. It's in sales tax. If you're on the state highway, federal income taxes are part of what has backfilled the Highway Trust Fund for a long time. And so we genuinely all pay for everything, and the single most subsidized form of transportation is actually driving.
Yeah.
And there isn't a driver out there who really wants to accept that. I have a car, I pay tabs, I pay all those things, and they say, sure, that pays for my car stuff. But it doesn't pay even half of the cost of the car stuff. And so if we could move away from who pays for what and just say, hey, we actually all benefit from every mode being able to function, we're all in this together. If I am on my bike, I'm not taking you as a driver, I'm not taking your parking spot, I'm not ahead of you at the red light, I'm over here, and I'm leaving more room for you.
Yeah.
And if I'm a freight train, I am bringing in stuff we all need. If I am ride sharing, I'm leaving more room on the road for when the ambulance needs to come through. Like, we all need all of this to work well.
Yeah.
And so I would really like us to move away from the myth that drivers pay for everything and move towards an understanding that the network really only works when it works for everybody.
The Oregon law that got passed recently, where there's a $15, I think, bike tax on every bike sold, is probably not going to help anything. It's only going to make it even more punitive for people who are riding bikes to feel like that they are getting penalized for choosing a better option in their opinion. But yeah, you make a great point that most people don't understand that the bike lane that was out in front of your house in Spokane, it wasn't that somebody's car or car tax paid for that. It was everybody paid for that. The people in that neighborhood paid for that, and they get the benefit of it, just like you said. So that's a great point. And the idea of a Mythbusters episode, I'll work on that.
You could have fun of that. And their real estate value went up when that bike lane went
in,
too.
Of course. Like, it's like putting in sidewalks, same thing. It's like, oh, you took away my easement. Oh, but I added, a lot of value to your home because now you're walkable. And the walkability score is something that's valuable and meaningful in real estate.
Yep.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with me today. This has been fantastic, and I will follow up with you on that Mythbusters idea.
Okay.
That's really cool.
Oh, we could have a lot of fun.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This was awesome.
Thanks. It was great.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 23 of the Group Ride Podcast. To send me feedback about the show, ask a question, or request that I cover a specific topic, contact me on Twitter and Instagram at the Group Ride Pod, and you can find me on Facebook at the Group Ride Podcast. Make sure you check out the podcast archives at thegroupride.com, where you'll find all of our previous shows. And be sure to rate us in your podcast player of choice. 5-star ratings help other riders find the show. Thanks again for listening. I'm your host, Wes Salmon. See you on the next Group Ride.